So, a European president just called Donald Trump a Russian asset. Now, it's one thing when a YouTube commentator calls Trump a Russian asset, or maybe a journalist doing some commentary says something, but the higher you go, the more of a burden or standard of proof you need. You never hear diplomats saying this sort of thing about this, like or presidents, heads of state, prime ministers saying this kind of thing. So when one does, you pay attention. Again, the higher you go, the more you have to be careful with your words and make sure that you can back what you're saying. Okay, so let's look at what just happened. Portugal's president, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, accuses U.S. President Donald Trump of acting as a Soviet or Russian asset. I saw that and I said, wait a minute. Okay, I generally trust Geo Insider. It's a reasonably good source. That's why it's in my newsfeed. Yeah, I see it again. Marcelo says Donald Trump is a Russian asset. And then we see this here. U.S. leader is a Russian asset. I'm thinking, okay, like maybe somebody's pranking me that, they're putting this out there and it's, maybe they're seeding misinformation. So I go out to Google and I just Google President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, Trump Russian asset. Nothing about him in the last 2 weeks saying that. So I go out to Ground News. When I go out to Ground News, sure enough, there it is. Trump has worked as a Soviet asset in the war against Ukraine, accused Marcelo. Okay, so we're looking through this and we see what's going on. Okay. I go into one of the articles and translates with Google Translate. Here's the actual article. The president of the Republic stated that his U.S. counterpart, Donald Trump, is currently acting as a Soviet agent by favoring the Russian Federation in the war against Ukraine. Okay, so for context, he's not saying he's deep undercover, being bribed by the Soviets, anything along those lines. Like the Soviets have something on him. They're just saying he is acting on in their behest or toward their benefit. Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa was the president. He said in a panel entitled The President's Responses, the head of the state gave an opening speech addressing the international situation, pointing to Donald Trump as an example of a new style of political leadership. It's really not new, but it's a populist style, and you're seeing that in a number of places. You see that with Modi in India. You see that in Orban. You see that in Trump. You see that in a number of newer. It's a more recent phenomenon that has sprung up. That is an older phenomenon that's just come back. Okay, more emotional and focusing on direct contact with citizens without mediation in a world where the balance of power has often also shifted. With one peculiar and complex thing, the supreme leader of the world's greatest superpower is objectively a Soviet or Russian asset. I mean, that's what he said. Objectively, a Soviet or Russian asset. He functions as an asset. Okay. I don't know that this word objectively is the right word to put here, but he functions objectively as an asset because he's actually kind of doing things on behest of Russia. And that's what the case he's going to lay out here. The president of the republic stressed that this is not an alliance based on friendship, economic, ideological, or doctrinal complicity. It's not like because he's a true believer in this. He says, I'm saying that objectively speaking, the new American leadership has strategically favored the Russian Federation, and I think that's very fair. I think anybody who's paying attention will say, like, he really zigs only this, like 95% of the time, zigs that way, and only kind of leans toward Ukraine periodically, maybe 5% of the time. He said, referring to the U.S. president's actions in the war in Ukraine. In other words, they went from being, this is really important, they went from being allies on one side to being the arbiters of the challenge. That's right. Trump repositioned himself. Biden was on Ukraine's side and was saying, hey, we're backing him. Trump repositioned himself as, I'm not backing you and I'm not backing you. How do I bring you together? And that was devastating for Ukraine. He said, adding that this is an arbiter who only wants to negotiate with one side of, or with one of the teams, excluding both Ukraine and Europe, which had to force themselves in the recent talks. Okay, so it's an arbiter who is actually leaning toward the other side. So that's what he said in this in this talk. So that's the context here. You see it again in other articles. But again, I didn't see it in Google. I saw it in Ground News, and I could follow it up with that. So that's what happened. And I think it's a fair analysis. He's not saying this is a sleeper agent, who's just doing his master's bidding. He's not. Again, commentators can say that because they're commentators, but the higher you go, the more careful you have to be. So that a European president said that is pretty stunning. Now, there's some evidence that, if you're looking at it objectively, you're going, well, why would you do something like this? Nearly 3 years after G7 nations restricted Russian diamond trade, the Office of Foreign Assets Control has extended U.S. import permissions for specific Russian gems through September of 2026. Why would you extend that? If you're trying to bring them to the table, wouldn't you use every lever in your power in order to try to bring Russia to the table? But that's not doing it. And then there's an effect on the American population. 2/3 of Americans are pessimistic that Ukraine-Russia peace deal can be achieved, 67%, with just 31% hopeful. Most see the conflict as stalemated, that's 2/3, while only 10% say that Ukraine is winning. A slim majority, 52%, favor supporting Ukraine to reclaim lost territory. So there's still a majority favoring Ukraine to actually be able to reclaim their territory. 45% prefer ending the conflict quickly, even if Ukraine must cede ground. So there's this ripple effect into the American population. Okay, let's look at big story number 2. Hungary did not condemn a Russian attack on Kyiv, which killed 18 Ukrainians. This was just last night. It was a terrible blow. It's like the 4th or so highest strike in the war, a drone and missile strike. They knocked down 93% of it. I talked about it this morning, but still there's stuff getting through and it's killing civilians. Hungarian officials have gone so far as to try to discriminate against members of the Hungarian community in Ukraine for defending our country, Zelensky said. Okay, so with that, there was also a war of words between the foreign ministers, between Peter Szijjártó in Hungary and Radoslaw Sikorski. Now, this happened about a week ago. Well, yeah, about a week ago. You saw this first one, and then it picked up again. So when the Druzhba pipeline was attacked, again for the 3rd time on August 22nd, Peter Szijjártó posted this. In a short period, cutting off oil deliveries to Hungary, this is a clear attack on our energy security and another attempt to drag us into the war. It will not succeed. We stand for peace and our national interests. And Radoslaw Sikorski replied, he's the foreign minister from Poland, said, Peter, you have as much solidarity from us as we have from you. That was a mic drop kind of moment, right? Okay, but then it's escalated some more. Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski responds to Hungary banning Magyar, the commander of the Magyar Birds. If you need some R&R and Hungary won't let you in, please be our guest in Poland, he says. Well, what's he talking about? Well, Szijjártó said this just a few hours back. In response to the latest Ukrainian strike against the Druzhba oil pipeline, the Hungarian government has decided to ban the commander of the military unit responsible for entering Hungary and the entire Shenzhen area. Okay, this entire area, what we're talking about here is the 29 European countries that have abolished the internal borders controls, allowing free movement of people in the EU. That's what they're talking about. Okay, so that's what the Hungarian foreign minister said. And so, yeah, so that's why Sikorski is saying, while the Russian missiles rain death on Kyiv, Hungary bans brave ethnic Hungarian, that's what Magyar is, he's actually ethnically Hungarian, he's Ukrainian, who dares to fight for Ukraine's freedom. Commander Magyar, if you need some R&R and Hungary won't let you in, please be our guest in Poland. So he's kind of thumbing his nose at this threat that all of Europe will be off limits to Magyar. Okay, Poland will enforce Hungary's, well, let me go back up here. So here's the comments here. Poland will enforce Hungary's Schengen listing as diligently as Hungary enforces Poland's European arrest warrant against former politician wanted here on corruption charges. So they're in a quite a spat. But again, this spat is at the foreign minister level. This is nothing like a European president accusing Trump of being a Russian agent. I think that's the first time I heard anything like that. Meanwhile, the commander of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, Robert Magyar Brovdi, responded sharply to Hungary's decision to ban him from entering the country, where his father was born. He said this, quote, "Shove your sanctions and entry ban where the sun doesn't shine, Mr. Dancer on Graves," he said, referring to Prime Minister Orbán. "There are enough real Magyars in Hungary. One day they'll be fed up with you too." And in another comment, he said, "And after you're gone, I'll come back and revisit the land of my fathers." Okay. Andrei Sybiha's foreign minister from Ukraine. How shameless to post this after a brutal attack by T-state Russia. Peter, you're talking to Sajaro. Peter, if the Russian pipeline is more important to you than Ukrainian children killed by Russia this morning, this is moral decay. Hungary is on the wrong side of history. We will take mirror action. Right? Yeah. I mean, like, let's think about this. Like, morally, don't you have something to say about what happened with what Russia did to civilians last night? In response to the strikes on the Druzhba pump station, Hungary announced that the commander of the AFU unit has been banned from entering the Shenzhen area. Why hasn't his name been announced? Says Taragami, an intelligence site that I rely on quite a bit. Why hasn't his name been announced? Because he is of Hungarian descent, which conflicts with their ultra-nationalist agenda. So they want to have this, we're all Hungarian and this nationalist, but they also want to please Putin and Russia simultaneously. Okay, next big story. Russian drones are monitoring U.S. and NATO weapons supply routes in eastern Germany. In response, Berlin is preparing legal changes to authorize the military to shoot down drones near bases. Legal changes to shoot down hostile drones. How about that? Like, okay, so, but Germany's doing something right. They're building shell, or they're producing more shells. Rheinmetall has opened a new munitions factory in Germany, just built in just 1.5 years. Once at full capacity, it could become Europe's largest artillery shell production site, possibly even the world's. Output is set to hit 350,000 shells annually, with much of it headed to Ukraine. Part of the problem that we have in Europe is, for the last decade or so, they haven't really been producing what they needed to produce, and so Russia, which has been producing it, has had a huge advantage. Now, it goes on, it gets even better. Germany's biggest arms manufacturer is scaling up shell production in other places as well. Okay, where? Europe's biggest defense manufacturer, Rheinmetall, will open 2 plants in Bulgaria to produce artillery shells and gunpowder, deepening the German corporation's position as a critical supplier of ammunition for the armed forces of Ukraine. An agreement for the shell production operation will be drawn up in 3 weeks, and the plant's target capacity will be 100,000 shells per year. So you add that with the 350. Now, again, not all of the 350 is going to Ukraine, but that's some progress. Okay, we'll end with this. Darth Putin, have you noticed that that's Sybiha, Peter Sybiha, the foreign minister from Hungary, have you noticed that he's more upset at losing his cut of the oil sales than about the kids we killed last night, thanks to his funding of our war? It's a good point. All right, my friends, that's all that I have for this video. If you got something out of this, please consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow. Thank you for the time, the likes, the shares, and the subscribes. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.